I am very pleased to welcome you to our event this afternoon. The School of Humanities is delighted to join the OWL Together events for Homecoming and Families Weekend for prospective students and our alumni. This panel is entitled Why the Humanities Matter in Times of Pandemic. And today you have the great fortune to have three of our most senior and distinguished faculty from the School of Humanities addressing this topic. Each are leaders in the school, and they are scholars of philosophy, English, and religion. So without further ado, I will introduce them as they speak so that you'll remember who they all are. So first is Timothy Schroeder, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Department of Philosophy. His fields of expertise include philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, cognitive affective science, action theory, moral psychology, and soon the philosophy of art, something he's working on as well. He teaches courses at Rice on the introduction to philosophy, the philosophy of mind, and graduate seminars on consciousness, rationality, and related topics. And last summer, he jumped in and joined the initiative to create a summer curriculum online for the School of Humanities, teaching a course, a very successful course on ethics in pandemics. Timothy has written extensively on the nature of desire, including a book, Three Faces of Desire, published in 2004 with Oxford, and another book called In Praise of Desire, also with Oxford in 2014. He's currently working on a new book entitled Reasons from Atoms, the goal of which is to explain the low-level neuroscience of action to philosophers. So you'll see that each of our speakers today crosses from the humanities to deeply engage the sciences in their own way. Timothy Schroeder.
Thank you, Dean Canning. And hi, everybody. It's really nice to be speaking with you, even though I can't see you. I feel that you're here. That's great. The dean introduced me as one of our senior scholars, and I was about to protest. I don't feel very senior, but then I thought, well, since March, I have felt more and more senior each passing day. And maybe you have had some of that experience too. I do feel it wearing on me just a little, also a little bit on my waistline. When I taught this summer course on ethics in pandemics that the dean mentioned, I discovered that the role I thought that philosophy might play was a role that was very much in demand from a whole bunch of students who had never taken philosophy before. The role was to sit down together and ask ourselves, what is going on? And who should be doing what? And why? And who is doing wrong? And why? And how could it possibly be remediated if it can? And to just work through all of these really fundamental questions that we're used to being able to ask and to answer in pretty straightforward ways in most of our lives. I mean, most of the time, I'm walking down the street and I think that a car doesn't give me a fair opportunity to cross the street. And I think about, protesting. I could yell, I could flip the drive of the bird, I could pick up a rock if I was really agitated, but I'm not going to do any of those things. All of those things are far from necessary. They're not helpful. I think they would be wrong in most circumstances. I'm used to navigating the moral world in ordinary ways a lot of the time. But then something comes along like a global pandemic and throws us for a loop. And all of a sudden we're asking new questions, we're wondering about new things, we're unsure of what the right or wrong thing to do is. And all of a sudden there are think pieces in the New Yorker and on amongst your friend circle about whether or not it's morally acceptable to order delivery food, or whether it's morally obligatory to order delivery food, and how much you should order. Has it suddenly become morally obligatory to order extra delivery food? Or is that like extra wrong? Oh my gosh, I don't know if you had this experience, but I did, and the undergrads I talked to over the summer did, and of just discovering how many questions we have once we enter a new domain of facts that we're not accustomed to thinking about. we talked about stuff ranging from the rights of governments to intervene in people's individual decisions and what the basis of those is, and how the pandemic instantiates particular bases of intervention, what those might be, right through to what good principles would be for distributing scarce ventilator resources, and then on down to the vexed question of whether it was right or wrong to ask somebody else to pick up your food for you and take on the risk of breathing the same air as the people making the food, but then shielding those people from the risk of encountering you breathing on them. We kind of worked through the whole gamut. And I thought maybe it would be fun to just take a minute to illustrate one of the things that we talked about, because it illustrates both the way philosophy works, how great some of our Rice undergrads are, and how philosophy just came to feel meaningful and urgent during the pandemic. So one day we were talking about the question of responsibility. So who's responsible for people being sick? Who's responsible for people being in the hospital? And we considered a couple of starting points. We asked, well, is China to blame? Is China responsible? Say the Chinese government, is it a responsible party? It didn't do everything that it could to contain the spread of the virus. If it had done everything it could to contain the spread of the virus, maybe the virus would never have left its borders. It effectively shut down the virus inside its borders. It could have spared everybody else, perhaps. And some people thought, well, like, that's a reasonable way to think. Either they're responsible or they're not responsible, and then somebody else is responsible. So you could say, well, even if they had done everything that they could reasonably have done, epidemiologists say that you can't really effectively contain a virus within borders without doing things that would have been totally unacceptable to international governments, like restricting the transit of US citizens out of China, for instance, and so on and so on and so on. And so then people said, well, so they're not responsible, somebody else must be responsible. But then one of the things that I found my students gravitating towards was an answer that, or an insight that I think philosophers have had for a while, and that's to distinguish a couple of different kinds of responsibility. And one is something like, is there a single causal locus of responsibility, like there's one cause, or there are multiple causes? And then also to say whether there's moral responsibility, to say that somebody potentially acted wrongly and was responsible as a result for a bad outcome. And people noticed, well, you know what? More than one person can act wrongly in that sense of responsibility, in the moral sense. It's entirely possible for a bunch of people in China to have acted wrongly and to be responsible for bad outcomes in the United States, and for a bunch of people in the United States to have acted wrongly and to be responsible for bad outcomes. And likewise, for a bunch of government actors in the United States to have acted wrongly and led to worse outcomes than would otherwise have happened, but also for all of the individuals who got sick to perhaps have acted wrongly also. And that wouldn't absolve the government actors, and the government actors acting wrongly wouldn't absolve the individual actors. And we all talked about this, and people seemed pretty content with achieving this amount of clarity as far as it had got. There's blame enough to go around if there's blame appropriate anywhere. But then people wondered, well, does somebody being responsible for getting sick mean that, like, they ought to suffer, that we ought to let them get ill, that we ought to let them die? Doesn't saying that somebody's being responsible, somebody's being to blame, mean that we see the harm they get as fitting for them, as appropriate, justified, something that it would be right for us to let happen or encourage to happen, or even make happen? I mean, when people are responsible for the killings of innocent people, and we think that the appropriate response to their responsibility is to punish them. is saying that people could be responsible, morally responsible for, having taken unnecessary risks and becoming sick. It is saying that they could be morally responsible for that, the same as saying that they would then be people who ought to be sick. And one student jumped on this really quickly and said something that I thought was super insightful. And as that idea made its way around the class, eventually about 2/3 of the class became convinced. So see what you think about this idea. The student said, and Rice student, so definite props to the owls here. We had some people who were visiting from other institutions or who weren't college students, but just auditing. But this is definitely a Rice student who made this comment. She said, if we say that somebody being responsible for something, somebody being morally to blame for something means that they ought to be punished for that thing, then we've conceptually defined the out of it possibility. We've defined out of existence forgiveness. Because forgiveness is what happens when somebody has done something wrong, but you shouldn't, or at least it's good not to let them suffer, not to make them suffer as a result of their wrongdoing. And that idea kind of worked its way around the class, and people were like, ah. And I thought, how great. Here are students recapturing what I think are some really great philosophical insights. I, of course, have peers, and for that matter, superior moral philosophers to me, who are going to disagree with me about these points and about any other points we could bring up. And that's the nature of philosophy. When we figure out how to address some philosophical question, then it stops being philosophy. It becomes, say, physics, or it becomes linguistics, or it becomes psychology. Just between us, a lot of philosophers think that we gave birth to psychology as a discipline too soon, and it hadn't finished cooking. But we definitely acknowledge that our domain is the domain of questions that remain frustratingly stubborn to us. But I think that student had a real insight there. And that experience of feeling like you've seen into the heart of some key moral question is a fantastic experience to get to share in a class. And when it helps you understand what you should think about the way that individuals have acted, groups have acted, governments have acted during the pandemic, it's just fabulous to see that these tools that those of us who build and hone and use them all the time care so much about have a role in the lives of 19-year-olds struggling to figure out what to make about the world around them too. And that was my experience of philosophy in the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Tim. I now have the pleasure of introducing Professor Kirsten Ostherr. She's Gladys Louise Fox Professor of English and the chair of the English department. At the same time, she directs the Medical Humanities program and the Medical Futures Lab, and holds an adjunct position at the University of Texas School of Public Health, Division of Health and Behavioral Sciences. Kirsten Ostherr's research on trust and privacy in digital health ecosystems has been featured in numerous publications: Slate, The Washington Post, Big Data and Society, and Catalyst. She's recently published research on medical humanities and artificial intelligence, and her writing on COVID-19 has been featured in Inside Higher Education and is forthcoming in American literature. She's currently leading a multidisciplinary project called Translational Humanities for Public Health that will identify humanities-based and humanities-inspired responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Her own books include Medical Visions, Producing the Patient Through Film, Television, and Imaging Technologies, published in 2013 by Oxford, and her first book, Cinematic Prophylaxis, Globalization and Contagion in the Discourse of World Health. I just note that you are welcome to type your questions into the Q&A, and I'm actually going to be grabbing those and trying to create opportunities for our panelists to address your questions at the end of their talks. Kirsten.
All right, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, all of you in the audience, for being here. I have 4 brief points that I want to touch on just in my opening remarks here. The first is something that I've been observing over the course of this pandemic, which has really stood out to me because it's something that we teach about in the humanities and in medical humanities in particular all the time. And that is the process of the construction of scientific knowledge or medical knowledge. So we have had this really unprecedented kind of front row seat on a process that usually only lab scientists experience, which is going from the discovery of a new disease to testing a whole bunch of hypotheses about what it is, how it works, what it might respond to in terms of treatments. And we've gone through this whole arc where, just in terms of thinking about infection, is it mostly droplets? Is it fomites on surfaces? Is it aerosols? How do we prevent them? Are masks important? Are they not important? Are ventilators life-saving, or are they potentially more dangerous than not for many people? What drugs can be effective? All of these questions are questions that really are about the way that knowledge is constructed, which is to say they're about a process that is the constant process of research, critical thinking, reflection, analysis, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat. And we've really been seeing that play out in the course of this pandemic, I think, in fascinating ways. So it's a good way of seeing for our students how the process of engaging in research is one of constant knowledge creation and testing and reflection and recreation. So I found that quite fascinating to observe in this process. Another thing, though, that comes from that is that when you see how that process works up close, you suddenly realize that facts and certainty are not readily accessible in the ways that we might wish they were. For students who are in our medical humanities courses, we often do work with them that is aimed at cultivating what we call tolerance of ambiguity and tolerance of uncertainty, for that matter. And these are both really important traits in medicine. I think if there are any medical doctors or other health professionals in the audience, you will probably recognize that there's a lot more gray area than there is black and white in medicine. Yet the process of training for the practice of medicine doesn't include a lot of cultivation of ability to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. And yet we can see in the process of this pandemic how every time we think we know something, we have to continue examining it and reflecting on it and gathering new information and dwelling in this realm of uncertainty, which is very challenging. And that's the experience that many patients have in medicine. So from our point of view in medical humanities, being able to help future doctors manage uncertainty and ambiguity while still communicating clearly and empathically to patients is extremely important. So that's also been something that's really come out of this whole pandemic process, just observing that in action. One other thing I want to mention, Dean Canning mentioned that some of my writing has been featured in the Washington Post. I wrote a piece. I was shocked to realize yesterday as I was reviewing for this panel that it came out on March 17th in the Washington Post, which seems impossible to me because I feel like we were barely starting this whole process and we didn't know what was going on. But nonetheless, I had a piece in there that was really drawing on my first book, which was about the history of public health films and the ways that they visualize invisible contagions. And importantly, the role of race, racism, and xenophobia in those public health films, which was not an intentional or even conscious element in them, but which nonetheless really played a role in how people thought about the spread of infectious disease around the world. And my point in that piece was that we are seeing the same kinds of narratives and visual iconography circulating again. So I wanted to draw people's attention to it and show the long history of that. And the last thing I will just mention is this Translational Humanities for Public Health project, I'm working with this fantastic team that includes undergraduate students, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and some of my faculty colleagues. And what we are really doing is looking for all of the different ways that people who are trained in the humanities are using their skills to contribute to the pandemic response in ways that we're going to highlight on a public-facing website that we're developing and will release over the next couple of months, and that I will invite you all to visit when it's ready. So happy to talk more about any of those things in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Great. You can hear me, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jeffrey Kripal. He holds the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University and was chair of the Department of Religion for 8 years. He joined the Dean of Humanities office as Associate Dean in the summer of 2019, and I've had the pleasure of working with him in that capacity since then. He's the author of 8 single-authored monographs, including Comparing Religions, Mutants and Mystics, Science Fiction, Superhero Comics, and the Paranormal, and authors of The Impossible, the Paranormal, and the Sacred. His present areas of writing and research include the articulation of a new comparativism within the study of religion that will put the impossible back on the table again. He's aiming to construct a robust and even conversation between the sciences and the humanities. And his most recent book, The Flip, Who You Are and Why It Matters, published in 2019 by Penguin, is an excellent example thereof. As one reviewer said, this is not a book that is anti-science, that would be contrary, but it is anti-materialist. And it seeks to actually cross the border that often exists between the sciences and the humanities in understanding consciousness. And I will turn over to Jeffrey Kripal, his assessment of the importance of why the humanities matter in pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Canning. Hello, everybody. So I want to begin with a little backstory with the last book that Kathleen mentioned, The Flip. This book was actually first published by a press in a hospital, Bellevue Hospital in New York City, by a little boutique press called Bellevue Literary Press that specializes in putting the humanities in conversation with the sciences. It was founded by a medical doctor who was growing increasingly concerned that the humanities and the sciences were essentially floating apart, and he wanted to bring them back into conversation. The editor there asked me to write this book. I work, as the title suggests, I work on unusual or extreme kinds of experiences, some of which are sometimes picked up and become religious, sometimes they don't, it just depends. So I worked on this book, and what I was really interested in is how the hospital has become a new site of transformative religious experiences, particularly around death and dying. I think human beings have always had transformative religious experiences around death and dying, of course, but that historically, most people have died. Recently, with the invention of new biomedical technologies, we can sort of reach in to the death process and pull people back out who are going further and further into the process. And so they're coming back with these pretty wild stories and pretty major transformative stories. And that's what I was really interested in looking at in this book. The book is primarily about scientists and medical doctors and engineers who are trained to think in strictly materialist or third-person ways about the world and about themselves. And then they have one of these experiences. They almost die, they take a psychedelic, they have some kind of spontaneous religious experience, and they realize in fairly dramatic and direct ways that there's an inside to the world, that there's a first-person view as well as this third person view. And in some ways, this first person view is primary, and this third person view of the sciences is in some ways secondary. They flip. That's what I mean by the flip, is this transformation from a strictly materials worldview to a worldview that now has an inside or a subjectivity to it. This does not result in a dismissal of science or materialism or objectivity. It simply puts that in a different context now. But I think what's important here, for the sake of where I'm going anyway, is that many of these flips occur in what we might call traumatic situations. They don't tend to happen when we're walking down the street or when we're having a beer or we're sitting around chatting, when we can do that again. They tend to happen around danger, death, and illness. And so the hospital becomes a major site of this. This book came out in 2018. In 2019, it was picked up by Penguin in London and reissued. And as a result of that book, I was interviewed on the BBC this last May by a philosopher named Shahida Bari. And Shahida asked me what the book has to do with the pandemic. And I struggled a bit. I told Shahida that the book was not written about the pandemic. It was written well before there was a pandemic, but that I think it had something to do, or could have something to do with the pandemic in this sense. I said that hundreds of thousands of people are being put on ventilators, and many of these people are dying or they're almost dying. And many of these people who are almost dying but do not die are going to come back, and they're going to talk about some extraordinary experience they had, but we're not going to hear those stories. Our culture does not allow us to hear those stories. It dismisses those stories as hallucination or as pathology or as some kind of drug effect. It essentially doesn't take them seriously. And I encouraged our listeners to take them seriously as sort of limit situations in which the human being essentially is faced with death and changes because of that. And I think that's the thing I most want to say about this pandemic as a whole. I think the pandemic is one long, gradual, potential flip for us. I don't think everyone will flip, obviously. I don't even think most people will flip. But I think in the back of our minds, somewhere deep down there, maybe not so deep down, we all think we're going to die. I know I do. We all think we're going to get this thing that we can't see, and that we're going to get very ill and that we're going to die in a ventilator alone. I think that's the fear at the back of our head or the back of our minds. And I think this is essentially what we would call a limit situation. It forces us to rethink who we are, to think what's important, to think about what a human being is, what a person is. And so I think all of this has, in some ways, made the humanities, made them more poignant, if not more relevant, certainly more poignant and powerful in the situation where we're all thinking about our mortality and we're all thinking about essentially the meaning of life and what it is we're doing here. So I think I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, all three of you, for amazingly stimulating presentations. And I see there are two questions in the Q&A. And Andrew, I'm not sure if we want to remove Spotlight or we want to rearrange the board, but I would like to invite those of you listening in to type your questions in the Q&A, and we will move through them as quickly as we can. And I would also invite the participants to connect their own remarks to each other's remarks, because there's a lot of wonderful connections that I heard. So one of the first questions, and thank you to Anusha Kadiyala for these creative questions. And it's one that maybe we could get all three of you to respond to, whether the question of pinning responsibility is why it's so important from a philosophical perspective. And I guess it's not directly present in the remarks that either Professor Ostherr or Professor Kripal made. It's definitely the topic, one of the topics of Professor Schroeder's remarks. So we could have all of you address it, or for certain, Professor Schroeder.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you very much for the question. The first thing I would always say is, in philosophy, you can never defend being interested in a question if somebody else isn't interested in the question. You say, I just work on it because I'm interested in the question. But I will say that it's not an idiosyncratic interest. So both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have made a lot of how they pin responsibility for the pandemic. And they think that that's important because they think that voters vote in part based on whether they think that the people that they are choosing or would be choosing to have as president of the United States are people who are going to actively prevent bad things from happening, whether they're going to have the necessary insight to prevent bad things from happening, and so on. And that's really what the question of responsibility comes down to, is was somebody in a position to affect the course of events? Did the person have at the person's disposal the necessary information? Did the person have goodwill to try to make things better, whether or not it worked out for that way? Did the person have indifference, didn't care whether it would go badly or poorly, or whether it would go well? Or was the person actually malicious and trying to make things worse? And those are things that a lot of people care about, including a lot of voters. I found a lot of my students cared about it, but I'm definitely not going to say everybody has to care about it. And some people really try to cultivate an attitude of being indifferent to the question of responsibility itself, and just try to always be very forward looking and say, well, like, how are things going to go best from here on, regardless of who did what to get us to this point? And I don't say that that is a bad attitude, but it's not a universally shared attitude. And there is a real question, if you take a backwards looking attitude, about how to do it accurately, as opposed to how to just do it based on your pre-existing loyalties and feelings. And the exploration of how to do it accurately, that's what we engaged in on that day in class.
Thank you.
I'd like to add a comment to that, if I may. This is looking from a completely different perspective, but in my research on the visual iconography of contagion, one of the things that I have noticed in the history of public health imaging, which has also been absolutely true in the case of this pandemic, is that images of maps, global maps in particular, are always everywhere in infectious disease outbreaks. And one of the things that these maps do is they enable us to visualize a tracing of the flow of contagion from a site of origin, presumed origin, to the site of innocent invasion. That's how it's often framed. I'm not saying that's true, but that's how it's often framed rhetorically. And one of the things that I noted early on in this pandemic was that the overemphasis on the idea of blaming China as the source of contagion led to actual testing protocols that delayed our understanding of how widespread the virus was until it had become completely endemic at the level of community spread all over the United States. So what I mean specifically is that for many weeks early on, the CDC guideline for whether you could even get tested required a travel to or from China in the past 14 days or exposure to someone who did, along with a few other symptoms. And in my analysis, this is really, it's about this question of pinning blame. And what it does is it orients our focus in the wrong direction in a way that can produce a false sense of security by constructing borders against that site. And as a result, we missed an opportunity to be ahead of the game in terms of testing. So, different take on that question.
All right, Jeff, do you want to weigh in at all on this question?
Well, yeah, I can just say two quick things. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yep.
I think there are real implications here for what we might call agency and for what we might call freedom. And by that, I mean, this pandemic is really about these tiny invisible organisms that no one can see, and that we do things like breathe and can be infected. And I think, so there's this real questioning of how much agency we actually have in this pandemic. How responsible can one really be? On the other hand, there's this question of freedom. You know, in the US, we tend to operate with this kind of individualism in which the individual has absolute freedom to do whatever he or she wants. But we know if that is followed through in a pandemic, that just increases and makes the pandemic stronger. So it's a real questioning, I think, of this whole notion of individual freedom and what that means in a community and how that can actually spread a disease if we were to act on this radical individualism.
Great. What a wonderful perspective you each offer on a question that's very broad. So maybe, again, this is a question that might well resonate with the three of you. So what role has technology played in the process of constructing scientific knowledge in the pandemic era? So I guess that's partly a question about how much scientific knowledge is itself changing. Is this changing the way scientists around the world are also collaborating with each other? And one question I'm just going to layer on top of that from my own perspective and listening to you all is, to what extent, Jeff just raises, the solutions to the pandemic we face are far more collective than individual. Like, how do we distinguish between those issues of responsibility and agency when we start thinking, distinguishing between individual freedom and collective reorientation, collective responsibilities? So I'm just piggybacking on the second question from our audience participant. So it originally was aimed at Kirsten Ostherr, but Jeff, just go right ahead, and then Kirsten, you're definitely asking this question to weigh in. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go first, but I had this thought. We both or all know this writer named Amitav Ghosh, who wrote this book called The Great Derangement, which is about climate change. And the basic idea is that the problem of climate change cannot be solved with our present political economies and our present ideas. It will take some radically new form of collective knowledge and action to address climate change. And I think we're seeing something similar with this pandemic. Our assumed values, just our basic human values, don't work. They make the situation worse. And again, this notion of individual freedom, I think, is a perfect example of this. And so we may need entirely new ways of thinking about collectivity and community and politics to really address something like a pandemic or climate change. And I don't think we have them. I just don't think we have those at the moment. And I think that's where the humanities and philosophy can really, really kick in if they're robust enough.
Thanks. Great.
I'll take this in a couple directions. One is just to say it is absolutely true that many pretty recent digital technologies have made it possible for us to have as rapid a biomedical response as we have had, from sort of digital prototyping, 3D printing, and a range of data science methods that have been transformative. The other part of the role of technology in the way the science has progressed, though, is in terms of data collection and sharing. And here is where I think there's also a really important humanities contribution, which actually we're seeing in the Translational Humanities for Public Health project. So everyone has seen the Johns Hopkins dashboard, definitely, right? And that map and the bar charts and the different data visualizations that are showing us, where the cases are spiking and whether, incidence is going up or flat or going down, and all of these things in relationship between testing and case numbers and these sorts of things. But people in the humanities who study data have pointed out for some time that data are always missing and data are always messy. And the missing part goes to who gets counted. There has been research showing the racial disparities, not only in who's affected by the disease, but also who even has access to tests, right? And then if they do get tested, if they do get sick, who has access to care, right? So when you can't even get tested, where do you show up in the data set? How does that story even get told? So there have been all these amazing humanities projects that have been doing kind of counter data collection and have been infusing data collection, trying to gather up the experiences in African-American communities, for example, with stories from those communities of how people have been affected. And so I think one of the really interesting things that for us to look at is not only the explosion of data and how it gives us certain ways to imagine what's happening, to model what's happening and to understand, but also the ways that critical perspectives on that can show us what is left out if we only think about a technological response to the pandemic, which it misses all of these spaces that just don't count when you look only through that lens.
And if
Great.
I may, I'll throw
Yes,
in
Tim.
one last thought. And it's to talk about specifically the questioner's question about cooperation, and to emphasize what an incredible thing it's been to watch thousands of research scientists around the world. It's almost like eavesdropping on them, talk constantly to one another, share ideas constantly with one another, and like imperfect, messy ideas and good ideas and bad ideas, and to just work out in real time the best opinions that they can work out as fast as they can work them out. And this is a case where the technology that we're seeing is just the power of the internet in all its different modalities. Scientists talking to each other on Twitter and sharing preprints and journals giving early pre-publication access and sending emails to each other, sharing data sets. Researchers in Italy having access to massive US data sets, researchers in the US having access to massive European data sets, all of that kind of stuff. From a distance, it can look very bad because we also see like, a terrible idea gets its shining moment in the sun and gets a lot of discussion outside of the sciences. But if you just watch inside the scientific process itself, those ideas, they were always going to get thrown around somewhere, and some of them were always going to have a moment in the sun. But over the process of scientific time, which is slower than we would wish for fighting a pandemic, but faster than anything philosophers have ever dreamed of for actually solving problems, you just see an incredible accumulation of knowledge. And the technologies used to create the knowledge are mostly older technologies, with a bunch of exceptions that Kristen mentioned, especially on production of viral DNAs and stuff done to create inoculations. But to me, the most amazing story of cooperation has been how, for all of the bad things that modern internet communications can generate, they can also create a community of 5,000 or 10,000 people all talking at each other super fast, but all actually learning almost everything they need to learn from each other in that process incredibly quickly. So that's been a real positive for me to watch, in along with all of the negatives that we've had to weather in these hard times.
Okay, there's a lot of questions accumulating. So for those of you typing in your questions, I will forward them on to the panelists, and you may possibly get an answer from them. We aren't going to be able to get through all of them. So one question that is really very interesting is, it comes out of a couple of questions, is the way in which religion might figure in this current crisis as either a kind of a set of visions of how illness can be healed and how actually the fractures in society that have arisen through the pandemic can be healed, or the ways in which exclusions have occurred and really very serious discriminatory behaviors as a result of this pandemic that then could be, in a sense, resolved through religion, in which one questioner asks, can we promote forgiveness and can religion be mobilized to encourage social equity, or is religion too divisive? And how, in a sense, it's a question that adds a layer of thinking about the role of religion in an era in which we're actually talking a lot about technology and responsibility. So I'm just weaving that in. We have a professor of religion and a philosopher who certainly skirts on the border of religious issues in discussing responsibility. Go ahead.
So I think I'll start that because religion's been invoked. I think the problem here is religious pluralism and technology, frankly. 100, 200 years, say 200 years ago, all of us would be born, raised, and die within maybe a 50-mile radius, and we'd live in a culture that was relatively homogenous, not entirely, but their religious answers would have essentially worked. There was a kind of function to religious belief that was effective. Today, we're all in communication, as on this Zoom webinar. Many of us live in cities where, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different religious worldviews. So to offer any specific or local religious answer to a global pandemic is not going to work. It's going to be more divisive, I think, than it's going to help. So I think the pandemic forces us into this realization that we actually inhabit hundreds, if not thousands, of different religious worldviews, and they're not compatible. And they're not particularly helpful here, although they might be helpful in specific communities. I'll just say one other thing. My earlier reference to near-death experiences are essentially proto-religious. They happen regardless of one's religious background, and they happen before they form into religious beliefs, and they don't have to become religion. Religion is an institutional social form that is really separate from what I was trying to address earlier. And I think we have to be really careful how we distinguish those things.
Okay. I'm not sure if either of the other panelists want to jump on that. Otherwise, there are more questions for you. I'll move on. So this, I would say, I'm going to jump ahead because I want us to have a range of questions. So one is how I would put the framing of the question as how we think key questions in the humanities might actually be changed by this very prolonged engagement. When I'm listening to Professor Ostherr explaining, she wrote this article on March 17th that maybe today, if she were writing it or adding to it and expanding it, would take new directions. I mean, what we know now compared to March 17th is hugely much, much more. So how do we understand the ways in which the humanities may change? And one question that's asked in the chat is what we actually think freedom is. This kind of comes back to Tim Schroeder's introduction. And if our president says, this is a fairly loaded question, so bear with us. If he says he's giving freedom to the American people, sort of liberate the cities, open up the economy, is he really giving us freedom to, is it actually a freedom to die? And so it does kind of involve all of you. And then a final question, because we're kind of getting to the last minutes of this webinar, are, how we can the question is framed as how we can enforce ideas from the humanities into medicine. But I would say we humanists don't want to enforce anything. We want to invite, we want to entice, we want to enrich with the questions that we're asking. So this is clearly one for Kirsten Ostherr about the ways in which the humanities can be brought more robustly into medicine and more systematically. And how can we also widen that out from medicine to the other sciences? And what examples do we have at hand from the past in which such humanistic ideas have actually been able to transform scientific thinking and practice? So it's a huge question, but take it in whichever direction. That's the whole point of trying to combine these questions into one big one.
I'll touch on a little bit of that and then pass it on to my other panelists. So, okay, so a couple things. I mean, one way in which you can directly see the humanities in medicine is through this concept called narrative medicine, which has come about. It's applied in a lot of different ways. One is just emphasizing the importance of hearing patient stories in order to really understand not just what they're going through, but what is actually important to them in terms of quality of life and what will work in terms of care. So the narratives in that case are often the narratives of patients. And I think those are extremely important now, and it has a really profound kind of quality when you think about how people being ventilated who cannot speak, and this sort of devastating experience of that, especially for their loved ones, for those who are trying to care for them. It's also been true that many, many, many health professionals, doctors, nurses, and others have been completely unprepared for the emotional trauma of this experience and need help dealing with it. They too have narratives that actually need to be told that might impact the way we think about the healthcare system broadly. So, this is just one example looking at narrative and medicine, but embracing this as an important concept has led to all kinds of novel practices in medicine, ranging from how electronic health records are shaped and what some of the critiques of them are, to what kinds of approaches to decision making should be encouraged between doctors and patients. I think that going forward, we really need to look at where we weren't ready in this pandemic and think about what kinds of research questions we could ask that might help us get ready, and not just get ready, but get ready in a way that really contributes to helping address a problem that is being experienced in the world today. And I'll pass it to my other panelists.
Great, thank you.
If I
Tim?
may,
Yes.
I'll pick up the freedom question, just because I think I can squeeze in 2 quick minutes on that. And I think I would say this, that I would say that the political debate that our questioner raises, I think is rightly framed in terms of saying something like this. We can have more freedom within the society that we live in to do stuff. And that can include freedom to do things that some people don't like and freedom to do things that almost nobody likes. We could, if we wanted to organize things that way, give one another the freedom to kill one another at will. That is, we could just make murder not be a crime. That isn't the way I would hope that we would choose to do things, but that would be an increase in our freedom. But it would be a decrease in other things that we also want. And I think I would fundamentally say this, that when we look around and we are glad that we live inside an organized society, that we're glad that we live under a democratic government, that what we're glad of is that we can exchange some of our freedoms in return for the benefits of cooperation. And it's that simple, that we give up the freedom to live as hunter-gatherers who will survive and die by the strength of our ability to find roots and club meanies. And what we gain by giving up that complete freedom is the benefit of doing things together with other people who have different priorities, and you have to compromise. And pretty soon you go from this beautiful vision of a hunter-gatherer society to society as a giant HOA. It's very unglamorous, but I think it's really good. It's really good to give up some freedom to cooperate with one another. And then we just have to find how to agree on how much freedom do we want to give up on in order to cooperate on which things. And that's kind of what the process of a democratic government is supposed to allow us to figure out together.
Great. Jeff, do you have any last remarks?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I see the clock. I just want to pick up on what Kirsten said about narrative medicine. You know, that's really what I was trying to get at in the flip. Whose stories count? And often what happens in a hospital is someone almost dies and comes back with an extraordinary story. And the doctor won't listen. You know, often the nurses will, but the doctors generally won't. And, you know, we just had a major intellectual in a webinar in our department, you know, this month actually, and he was on a ventilator with COVID. And, you know, his story was he saw his ancestors. And he told that story because he could tell that story in that context. But this is kind of my point, is we need these stories, and we need to think about how our public culture won't listen to some stories, but will listen to other stories, and kind of create a broader, more capacious public culture.
Thank you. Those were great answers. A final question that is in the chat, and there's many more that we can't answer. This is one of the earlier ones, is how interested listeners tuning in today can support the school's important work. And I would just say we have a wonderfully newly relaunched website, and you can learn more about our programs in medical humanities, in environmental humanities, and also in the departments of philosophy, religion, English. We are building what we're calling at Rice a connective humanities that very much aims to do to engage questions in the ways that our senior scholars here have engaged them today, that ask big questions and that draw on various disciplinary insights, and then cross those disciplines to compare and create conjoined knowledges. And so we're really, and it's really important to us in the School of Humanities to equip ourselves in those humanistic ways to be able to answer these enormous questions that we're now facing, that we couldn't have anticipated really last January. So we're at 2:59. We would love to see all of you in a room where we could chat, and there would be time for mingling about and having a cup of tea or coffee. But we're really sorry we can't do that. But this has been an enormous amount of fun, and we think there were 73 people on at the height, and now we still have 61. And so we're going to actually save the questions and send them on to the speakers. And if they can possibly do it, they may well write you back. So we appreciate your attention, and we're thrilled you could join us today. And thanks especially to our panelists. Take care, everyone, and on to the other OWL Together events. So if those of you are with prospective students or students entering college, please tune in tomorrow at 4 o'clock to hear the event on about careers in the humanities. And at 2 o'clock on Thursday, we'll have another panel on, indeed, the vision of a liberal arts education and the changing role of the humanities and the arts in that liberal education. Thanks very much, everyone.